Okay, so as we start the second semester, this unit will start with this thing we call the Gilded Age. This is definitely one of the most complicated eras of U.S. history to try to learn. It's one of the most complicated eras of U.S. history to try to teach. And you have to watch out for all the interconnections that exist between each of the different topics. So this right here is just the introduction to get you going real quick. Just kind of a quick overview of what it is. Okay, so what is the Gilded Age? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to first answer some other questions. First of all, when was it? The Gilded Age exists in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, and one of the problems with it is when do we date it? Typically, you're going to see the dates between 1865 and 1900. Depending on who's writing the book, depending on who's writing the questions, you might see different dates. Some of them might start it after Reconstruction, 1877, which then gets confusing when they're going back into the late 1860s talking about some of the developments. Some of them will end it around between 1890 and 1900, just depending on what they see. The reason the dates are different is because it does overlap with other eras in U.S. history, one of which we've talked about, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. We don't talk about Reconstruction with the Gilded Age because Reconstruction was specific to the South and dealt with all the changes in the aftermath of the Civil War. It overlaps with the imperialist era. Well, when was America looking at being an empire? You'll see question marks here at the end of the dates. Did we start deciding to be an empire around 1880? Before that, after that, when did we decide we were going to be an empire? And then when did we decide we were no longer going to be an imperial power? Some places will date it as late as 1925. Some places will say, well, we kind of continue to exercise that American imperialist attitude. It also overlaps with this thing called the Progressive Era. Now, one thing pretty much every textbook does is wherever they say the Gilded Age ends, that's where they say the Progressive Era ends. But some will say that the Progressive Era begins in 1890. Others will say it doesn't begin until 1900, 1901. So these dates are going to cause you some problems. What all does the Gilded Age include? Well, it includes lots of different topics. It includes the growth of what we think of as the first big businesses in the United States and the rapid expansion of the U.S. economy in the late 1800s, what you might have heard of referred to as the Industrial Revolution or the Second Industrial Revolution. Associated with that is the formation of labor unions, and here's where we start to see some interconnections. When businesses grew, they took advantage of their workers. When workers were taken advantage of, they formed labor unions to fight back against the businesses. You also have the growth of cities. Millions upon millions of people are going to be moving to the cities, so many that by the time you get to 1920, for the first time in U.S. history, more people lived in the cities than lived in the rural areas. There's also going to be demographic changes in immigration to the United States. We'll see a group of people called the new immigrants. We'll look at them later. But the demographics were just different. There's also more of a focus on political corruption, not only in trying to clean it up, but also in just corrupt politicians and organizations taking over, but then also being exposed. Because of the political corruption and because of what businesses are doing and because of what's going on in cities, you will see attempts at social reform, political reform. We could throw economic reform in this as well. It also includes the West. And so if you think about the Indian Wars and the putting of the Native Americans onto reservations, that's also included in the Gilded Age. And it seems kind of random, but with the political corruption, you know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is probably the most corrupt political organization in U.S. history. Also, the big businesses, railroads are one of them. People got on railroads to move out west, and so All these things are interconnected. They're not isolated. So as we go through the notes, and as you see things in class, try to look for those connections. And that should maybe make it a little bit easier to understand why something over here, say here in the growth of big business area, how does that affect the political corruption? Or how does the changes in immigration maybe affect what's going on out in the West? Those things do exist. They are there. Okay. So lastly, when we look at what is the Gilded Age, we have to ask, why is the Gilded Age important? Well, other than the fact that it is this 35-year period, this era in U.S. history resulted in massive changes in the United States in terms of our economy, in terms of our politics, in terms of society. Okay? Economically, we became a world leader just through the sheer volume of what our economy was able to produce. Issues are going to show up in the Gilded Age which are going to be discussed and debated and fought over even today. You know, how rich is too rich? The widening gap between rich and poor. Are the rich paying their fair share in taxes? Is the government regulating business effectively and appropriately? Is government interfering with business? These are all things that we talk about today, but they're things that were talked about in the Gilded Age more than 100 years ago. These issues are not new. They dealt with economic inequality. They also dealt with discrimination. We'll see in one set of notes, we'll see the rise of segregation. So that's where we end. We'll look at all these other issues in future videos.